but we wanted to make sure that we recorded Miss Haylee Mills. Everyone give her a hand. She is the Splunk representative, so she's going to go through some information for you all. I am going to I am going to require that you take notes, because what you learned today is what you're going to be using on Friday. So when we do our Splunk, when we go through our Splunk iteration, it'll be a lot easier for you to make sure that you know kind of sort of what you're doing, have an understanding of what you're doing, and then you'll be able to use the SPL language that we're going to be using. So with no further ado, this is Miss Mills.
Hey friends. Cool. So I didn't know exactly what to cover, but like log analysis is my favorite thing. I mean, that's what we're doing in most modern security operations. It's detection and response. And there's all sorts of like cycles and theories and all sorts of things, but I have my own theories around like what's helpful and what's not. So a little bit about my background. I used to draw cartoons in a past life, but 80-hour weeks with 40 hours of pay, living in Los Angeles and barely surviving was not sustainable. So after my quarter-life crisis, living with my parents, I was talking to a friend of mine who had moved into cybersecurity from IT administration. And he was like, well, you can figure it out. And I'm like, well, like, how much is a starting pay? And he's like, I don't know, like 60 to 80 grand a year. And I was like, oh my God, I could make 60. Like, that was my initial impetus was just like, I would like money to survive on after being a starving artist in Los Angeles. But quickly found out it's a freaking fascinating field. It is very cool. It's always evolving, which I think works with my like ADHD, autism brain. I just want to like learn new things all the time. So cybersecurity is a perfect fit. And I realized I like had a lot of skills that translated. Like, I mean, there's a lot of digital production elements to art. But it wasn't just art, it was also video games. Like I love video games, and I think gamers technically like have a lot of skill sets that translate to cybersecurity. Interestingly enough, like at least the way I would phrase it is that like when I get dropped into a game, I'm like trying to read the grammar of the world that I'm in. I'm trying to figure out like the fingerprints of what leads me to my objectives, that sort of thing. So it's often like systems thinking is what it makes me think of. And no matter what you've learned in the past, you've always like you are developing like a mental model in your head to understand something. And I think it's like, you know, you're at school right now, but like you've mastered all sorts of skills. And, you know, we master things when we're young, just figuring out like what not to eat and not to put your hand over the burner and stuff like that. But it's all like systems thinking. Your brain is meant to work this way, and you can draw all sorts of connections. So I like sort of throwing in my past as like an animator and all these other things, like in video games, because I think no matter what skill set you have, there are like lots of cross-translatable skill sets into cybersecurity. So just, I'm going to cover a little bit like my like theory about like what is helpful when you're doing analysis, because you know, I didn't just want to show Splunk and be like, here's the tool and it does the thing. It's like, no, what are you doing with the tool? How are you using the tool? Why are you using the tool? I think it's way more important. And we'll like, you know, actually go into Splunk and like do some cool stuff too. But I thought framing it this way, so like, no matter what you learn, it's relevant. You know, just anything in IT, because cybersecurity is such like a, I mean, it helps to have that like inch deep, mile wide knowledge of everything. So there's like nothing you could learn in IT that's not relevant. Like, because, you know, whether it's cloud or like, you know, running a VM or like, everything that you learn is going to be helpful, because now it will be part of your analysis as a cybersecurity analyst, like looking at things from different angles, like why is this connected to this? And it is systems thinking. It's turtles all the way down, which if you don't know the phrase, I will explain in a second. But yeah, so my main point is just that understanding something is understanding how things relate to each other. Rather than, you know, thinking of like when we do log analysis, it's not necessarily you're just following like step 1, do this thing, step 2, do this thing, step 3. It's like you want to know why are the steps those, and like what are you meant to be doing at those steps, and what could be in those steps that maybe aren't there that like you bring to the picture. Because like when I started as a SOC analyst and a lot of places, you might be in a place with like an immature process, like investigation process, where it's just sort of like do the thing, do the thing, do the thing, and it could actually use improvement. But if you're just doing the thing and not providing feedback to the engineers and your leads that design the process, like it's a collaborative thing, security. And so like I think thinking of what you could understand based on what you know and what you don't know is very cool. So the idea is just like systems theory. You can go into this, like Gregory Bateson and his daughter talk all sorts of cool stuff about this. But like things are only things in relation to other things. Like we only understand a chair because it's not a table, and like everything is related to everything else. So I just like want you to keep that in mind when we're thinking about log analysis and like attackers and defense, because the like lateral thinking required to think about how an attacker maybe gets in your network, like thinking about what an attacker does. And also when you're doing defense, like thinking about what are your gaps, like where are the things that I know we don't have defenses for, we know we aren't detecting, like, so how do we find those things? So we'll talk about threat hunting versus detection and response as well, because you've got to search intentionally for things that you don't know that you don't know. So just some strategies about like critical thinking and like problem solving in that sense is context. Like you could learn a thing, but it's like how and when do I use that thing? So your like networking knowledge is going to be relevant sometimes. Other times it's going to be like how cloud permission user roles are abused, like like how an attacker can pivot machine to machine to like abuse a role that this system has or this user has to jump to the next system or user. It makes me think of this very cool tool called Bloodhound. I don't know if y'all have used in your ethical hacking classes, but it's a tool that looks at Windows Active Directory and like tries to reach it. So domain admin is sort of like the crown jewels of an Active Directory instance. It's the user profile that can create and assign all permissions in an Active Directory structure. So like in a network, it has all the control. So attackers are often trying to reach domain admin because it basically gives them free access to the network anywhere they like. So what Bloodhound will do, it will like do all this like passive scanning, just like internal scanning of all your roles, and then try and jump over and over to like find the path to domain admin. So yeah, there's just so many lateral thinking type things involved in cybersecurity, and I'm just going to probably get distracted by examples as I think of them, because that's systems thinking and lateral thinking. So turtles all the way down, I just really like this phrase. It's from Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. It's fantasy novels, but they're very great moral and ethical stories and just very cool. But the premise is that the world is sitting on top of an elephant, which is sitting on top of a turtle. And like, if you critically think just like you're like, well, what's under the turtle? And the answer is, it's turtles all the way down. Which I think is a very silly analogy for just like how things are just interconnected all the way down. There's no other way to explain it. And you are also a system. I like throwing this in there, especially because I've had parts in my life that are difficult, and like, learning is maybe more difficult when you're not taking care of yourself. So like, I like to think of yourself as like something you take care of, like this system you take care of, and it will help take care of you. So I mean, I meditation, therapy, pharmaceuticals to help you get to where you need to be. That's just like something to throw in there that. I mean, we can talk about later, but I just like to think of it for everyone. And then this is just a cool quote from co-founder of Twitter and Medium, Evan Williams. The information we consume matters just as much as the food we put in our body. It affects our thinking, our behavior, how we understand our place in the world, and how we understand others. So just like, you can think of that not only while you're learning and how you do cybersecurity, but like how you approach life and how you approach life in cybersecurity, because I know a lot of people in cybersecurity that are very stressed out, and it can be an anxiety-inducing job, because especially if you sort of like think, well, if we get breached, like all of our customers, and it's my fault that I didn't detect the breach. So I think like taking care of yourself, taking care of the information you curate into yourself is also an important piece of being in cybersecurity. And so just more strategies about like something that will be helpful if you are going to pursue being an analyst. It sounds boring as hell, but documentation. And it's not just important because the business needs you to document like what is the evidence? Why did you make that determination it's bad or not? It also helps with learning. I've found even if you're not ever looking at your notes, just taking notes as you do stuff and like while you're working with Splunk, you're like, oh, this command did this thing for me. And you're like, oh, like later on, you know, maybe eventually you build it into your brain and you don't need to reference your external brain. But building an external brain as you go can be so helpful for like figuring out how you did something in the past. Like a lot of the things I learned when I was learning cybersecurity from my friend, like I still reference those notes every once in a while when I need to build out like Security Onion, which is a cool Linux distribution for doing cybersecurity. But just building that out sort of as you write it, your brain's sort of like, oh, you wrote this down, maybe it's important. Maybe I'll store it a little better than I would if I just, you know, heard it and then it disappeared out the other ear. So documentation is about finding what's important, documenting as you work, and then outputting what you know. And not in just the context of like an analyst where you'll be doing this all day, every day. And maybe it gets a little boring because you're doing the same thing over and over. But hopefully you work at a place that like you get to work with the engineers, you get to help design the process, help to evolve the process. And it's not just doing the same thing over and over because it's meant to be a cycle that improves and evolves, but it isn't happening in every place. So, you know, you can also sort of go into a place that's not like that and try and change it a little bit, but it's outputting what you know can help sort of cement what you know as well. And then just one more thing on critical thinking because I think it's such a cool topic. So the idea, I've sort of already started talking about this, but pattern matching versus critical thinking. So I was trying to come up with a term for like what is just following steps. But it's like, well, the pattern is like, well, here's how you do addition. It's like 2 + 2, and like now when you see in that, like now it's 40 + 70, and now it's 3,000 + 7,000. Whatever it is, you're just following the pattern. Like, oh, I've done this before. I have added 2 numbers together. I'm going to do the same thing over and over. So like the difficulty is when there are things you don't know about that you're assuming you're doing with the same pattern, but it is an accounting for something you don't know about. So it's just very common to have processes that don't necessarily include all the potentially relevant context. And so it's like up to people getting into the industry to evolve the industry when they get there. So like bringing critical thinking skills and the sort of like intentional evolution of the incident response process as you become an analyst is very important. And I hope to see y'all in the industry making money and affording houses and also enjoying your job. And I mentioned this briefly, but again, I'm obsessed with video games. I think something that video games teach really well is like, yeah, there are patterns in video games, but ultimately you're building a model to understand the game, like as you play the game over and over. So I have one example here. I think this is Dark Souls 2. If you've ever played any of the Souls games, they're very, very difficult, which is what games used to be like back when I was a kid.
Actually, that's Dark Souls 1.
It is Dark Souls 1. Okay, I wasn't sure because I've only played 3 and Bloodborne and Elden Ring. But thank you for the clarification. You recognize the Taurus demon. Okay. And so something interesting. I think this is Dark Souls 2. That in the very beginning of the game, you like walk out, and to the left there's like an open field, and to the right there's like a little catacomb of hallways, and it looks like video games often teach you. They sort of have these like rails that kind of guide you where to go. So it looks like I should go over here into the field. And as you go into the field, there are these very difficult monsters that are far too difficult for a beginner player. But eventually you just keep running into that wall. And eventually you're like, well, fuck it, I'll just check out the catacombs over here. And it's such a smart decision because it teaches you that like, you may not be equipped for that area yet, just sort of explore, and it guides you into this where you're supposed to go. Like that's actually the beginning of the game is that right path, but it doesn't look like it. And I think it's a genius way of like teaching you to build a model as you play that like, this area might be too dangerous. And then another example I really like, there's a style of game called roguelikes, based off of this old game, Rogue.
Roblox?
rogue likes. Yeah. No, not Roblox. Oh gosh. Oh gosh, when I see my nephews play Roblox, I'm like, oh, there's so much better games out there to play. But roguelikes are like a style of game that usually permadeath is like part of it. Like you're meant to try and complete the game, but it's very, very difficult until you've figured out the patterns in the game of like items that are good to use. So like, for example, when you get in a room in Binding of Isaac, there are multiple items to choose from. And as you play the game, or other roguelikes that are very similar, you learn what items do, and you're like, oh, this would synergize with that. And it's never really outlaid for you. There's just a lot of randomness involved. And you just get so good at playing the game by building a model of the game that eventually you become good at like predicting the enemy behavior, as well as like picking the power-ups that would help you solve, like get to the end of the game. So I just think video games are just such an excellent analogy for what we do in cybersecurity. So all that, just my prefix to about like actual attack and defense, and we'll get to Splunk at the end. I have what, an hour and a half? Question mark?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And what time is it right now?
11:26.
Okay. Cool. Because I want to make sure it's saved. Oh, thank you. I want to make sure it's saved at least 15 minutes for like demoing kind of cool stuff. So I like first to think about attackers, because we have to know what we're defending against to understand why we are doing our defenses. And it's like, well, what are we defending against? Ultimately, these are usually the things that a company is worried about. That's why they hire cybersecurity teams, build out cybersecurity tools. Is that either identity theft, when you have personal identifying information, PII, of many individuals. It's very profitable to buy those and then sell those on the dark web. If you're not familiar with like the dark web economy, it's fascinating, and there's books about it that are very interesting, and I'm happy to talk about those later. But they can often like breach a place. They can sell identifying records. They can sell access to the networks that they've broken into, so that other people could do the actual work of finding out what's on the network. Other times it's like, well, there's nothing useful here, just click ransomware and ask for like $10,000. Or, there's various ways that they can make money off of that, but that's partially the interruption of critical services. The reputational damage is an interesting one. It's kind of hard to prove, but ultimately, like when Target got breached, they're like, we lost 45 million people's information. It's like, well, that doesn't look good in the SOC section. Usually they recover. It's interesting how short-term some of this reputational damage, because people just sort of forget, and there's another breach, and then things just go on business as usual. But it's interesting, just recently, like ransomware gangs have gotten so much more operationally proficient. Like they used to just be like one person like hacking, clicking the button, asking for money. Now it's like they are like little companies and like little startups, and like you can be an affiliate. Like you're kind of like a franchise, like a franchise of ransomware, where they give you the tools, they give you like a PDF of like, here's how to like find their accounting information and how to make sense of their balance sheet. It's like literally like an employee training. And then when you get ransomware, it's often like you're talking with like a customer support agent that's like, hello, how can I help you today? And you're like, well, you breached me and you have all my files. And you're like, okay, great. Well, do you need help buying cryptocurrency? It's absurd when you look at some of these conversations that they've improved so much. But regardless, to get back to reputational damage, oftentimes it is now a double extortion technique, where they're not only ransoming it, they're also exfiltrating that information before they ransom your company. And then if you don't pay, not only are you getting your files locked up, they are publicly releasing all your files. So it's like it's a double extortion. It's two ways of blackmailing you to do what they want. And then obviously the economic impact on individuals and companies, especially when like a big thing like Equifax gets breached, and Equifax being one of the worst ones because they have social security numbers. Like often PII is just like your name and address, which is, those are easy to find on the internet too. But social security numbers is kind of the big one, because that is really important to doing all sorts of different kinds of fraud. But regardless, this is what attackers are doing too. And this is why they do it. I mean, I get it. Like, we live in a prosperous country. A lot of attackers don't. And so, like, they can learn some computer skills and funnel wealth from wealthy countries. So it, like, makes sense that ecosystem exists. And it also gives us a job. So, like, somewhat mutually beneficial, ethically, who knows? So this is just a report that Splunk releases every year. But yeah, 49% of organizations suffered a data breach in the last 2 years, or business disruptions, lost confidential data. 60%, it's probably the other 40% don't have security teams because that is a full-time job all the time. And this is generally bigger companies. Really, like if you look at the data on small companies, like often small companies, they shut down. Like you get ransomware, you don't have $50,000 liquid to like get your money back and get your services back up and running. So like really the small and mid-sized business area, it needs so much help. And like one day we'll figure out how we can help them the best. But there's lots of consultancy firms that do that type of small, mid-sized stuff as well. But the numbers for them are terrifying because most multinational corporations don't shut down permanently forever when they get ransomware. But that threat does exist. Okay. So who put animations in here? I just thought this was interesting of like what the different attacker things are going after, and I'm sure potentially you've been introduced to the CIA triad in security: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. So confidentiality, keeping things secret; availability, making sure it's necessary when it is necessary; and integrity, making sure it's not altered or messed with in any way. So the way that attackers can mess with each one of these individual things, either disclosure in the confidentiality circle, destruction and denial on availability, and integrity alteration, although I feel like that's probably the most rare. I mean, if anything, they're altering just to like cover their tracks, not necessarily like maliciously, like changing your phone number, like they don't know how to call you or something. But regardless, it's like that CIA triad was developed by like intelligence agencies in like the 30s and 40s, like as a concept to think about how we secure things. And I mean, so much of those 30s and 40s intelligence strategies are still how we think about security today, even though we've moved into like cyber warfare, and like those principles still apply, and they're very interesting. So I don't know if you've been exposed to this concept yet, but there's always going to be a question on every cybersecurity exam that tries to get you to mess this up. But the idea of threats, vulnerabilities, and risks. So what is the overlap? So vulnerabilities are things that exist, whether it's the vulnerability of your people because they're trusting and kind and they give out information, or it's your servers and like data that you may have in the cloud, or it's your workstations. Like these things can develop vulnerabilities, whether it's applications, something built into into the operating system. It's unfortunate when we find out about those. And then threats are the like people that can take advantage of the vulnerabilities. They're the threat actors or the potential ways to access things that have vulnerabilities. And risk is what is generated about the combination of those two. The things that have vulnerabilities generate risk because there are threats that can take advantage of the vulnerabilities. And I'm sure you'll get a test question at some point on some exam about that. So good luck sort of making sense of it. This is something I just thought was very interesting. It's the predator-prey equations. So you'll notice like as the numbers of the snowshoe hare increases, there's a corresponding increase in the Canada lynx of hunting them, and then they die out. And then there's more rabbits, and then there's less rabbits, but then there's less lynx because they don't have rabbits to eat. And so it's interesting that they were able to map this sort of like population growth and like corresponding growth of the attacker upon the poor bunny. But I saw something similar in a graph for IoT devices and the number of cybercrime damages. Granted, this is a guesstimation. I think this data was from 2020, and this was a guesstimation of that graph increasing. But over the years, cybercrime damages is just shooting up because I think IoT devices is an interesting one just because they've been notoriously unsafe. They release just like default username and password. So like, I don't know if you've heard of the Mirai botnet, but still one of the most powerful botnets of all time because security has somewhat improved since then. But it's a fascinating story about these kids at a college campus that were like taking down rival Minecraft servers, and it's a very wild story. There's a great Wired article about it, but they were able to compromise a huge, massive botnet of IoT devices because of the default credentials, where they would just scan the internet, and if anything returned a response that was like one of those, like the signature of those devices, then they just log right in and install their malware, and now they had a little zombie they could control, and still had like one of the highest throughputs of a DDoS attack of all time, and that was like 6 years ago, 7 years ago. Regardless, this will continue as we use more and more tech. We expand the attack surface, and attackers will fill in the gap. So just a few different types of attackers to think about. An insider threat, there is also a subdivision of insider of like unintentional insider, like when you click on a phishing email and you're inside the company, like whoops, you let the attacker in, you're an unintentional insider threat. But there are also definitely intentional insiders, like other countries or other companies will reach out and ask for like sort of proprietary information and ask for you to extract that information and give you huge lump sums. This happens pretty regularly. And there's also like this sort of like people thinking like, well, I can take this, and companies don't like that. So if you're thinking about that in the future, just be more aware that they're better at catching it than they ever have been. Cyber criminals, that's sort of the ransomware operators, those types that are just purely in it for the money. And then nation state actors, if you haven't read an APT report, they are so fascinating. So the first one was released by this company, cybersecurity company Mandiant, in like 2008 for APT1. Like they coined the term, and they had so like it's interesting because every government is like, no, we don't do that. Like we do that, the U.S. government does that, China does that, Russia does that. But like you can't prove it, even though you have 99.9999% accuracy. No one will ever admit it. But that APT1 report, like it pins down the arm of the like they found the recruiting page for the person who's like good at colloquial English and also has hacking skills, and like they nailed it down to the building that those attacks originated from in China. And so it's just fascinating. And like the U.S. has shadow brokers that broke out the Equation Group leaks a while back, which all had names of the implants that Snowden talked about. Like Snowden released those things and talked about all these agents, and then later the shadow brokers released this group called the Equation Group. So that's a U.S. government cybersecurity arm, and they pay a lot of hackers very well to develop exploits that are sometimes on companies that are U.S. based. Don't tell them about it because they want the access where those tools are used in other countries, so they can just hack right in. So nation states are some of the most powerful and difficult to detect because they're so skilled. They have so many resources because they're funded by governments, so they have millions of dollars to pay people very well that are very smart people, and some of the most difficult attackers to detect. Hacktivists, they just have a cause and they want to hack for a cause. And then thrill seekers, they just like seeing what they can do. There is a renowned hacker who just recently passed this year, Kevin Mitnick, who's just like very well respected in the hacker community. He has a great book called Ghost in the Wires, talking about his time leading up to getting caught by the FBI and then working for them because he kind of had to reduce his sentence. But he's very much like, if you read that book, you'll see that he's the thrill seeker type. He just is interested in like, what information can I get and what can I do with the information that I have. I'm sure he had like some ethical things that like we all do when we got a little power, and but like just there are those types as well, which are not quite as malicious. Those are the types of things they're looking for. I'm sure you've heard of most of these attacks types. Phishing, which is a type of social engineering, but generally just trying to get information from someone, whether they know it or not. And usually you're using like the trust that people have. They're willing to give out information. One of my favorite Mitnick stories in Ghost in the Wires is he called a police. He was trying to get information about someone's driver's license to like get their address, and he called the police and they were like, "Oh, we need your PIN code." Like he pretended to be from another department, from the IT department. They were like, "Oh, we need your PIN code." He was like, "Oh yeah, sorry, I'll get that." Hangs up, calls another place, and was like, "Hi, I'm from the IT department over at like Rothsfield, California. And my records indicate that your PIN code is like 34879, and I was just confirming just to make sure we have it right on our end." And they're like, "No, actually, it's 72687." And just like it's brilliant. There's a village at DEF CON called Social Engineering Village, and they have a challenge every year. They put someone in a box, and they get to do some homework on the company before they call, but they have like flags they need to get, like internal information about the company. they get 2 weeks of homework, but then they come in with their homework and their notes, and then they are attempting to just call people and just get information, extract information. It's fascinating to watch because sometimes you'll notice someone's a little suspicious, and so they have to figure out how to get around it, or like they'll even say, like the person they just hung up on who was suspicious, they call the next person, and like, oh, I talked to Carl, and he just didn't know, da 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 da, and they're like, oh yeah, no problem, and it's so cool to watch. You're familiar with malware, and ransomware is a type of that. Botnets, it's sort of like zombies control them to do stuff for you, and then DDoS is often the thing you get a botnet to do for you. So I thought this material is actually from the Splunk Cybersecurity Defense Analyst course, which is free. There will eventually, we kind of have a cert that's in the making, but we have 3 of these modules released out of 7. It's a very cool little course that I helped work on. There's also the Google Cybersecurity Analyst course, which covers a lot of similar information from a different angle. But just so you know, that's where I'm getting these slides from. And there's a lot more in there than what I'm covering. But generally, there's sort of 3 types of attacks, or 3 surfaces. So generally, you've got the social engineering surface, like people are dangerous because they can potentially leak information. Or you can attack workstations. Often you're attacking the workstation by social engineering with phishing or something. So then you gain access to the workstation. And then from the workstation, you can pivot to their infrastructure. But also there are attacks that start at the cloud. Like they are able to work into your network, like figure out the things they can abuse from the outside and then work their way into a network. But generally, these are the 3 places that get compromised, either the person, the workstation, or infrastructure, whether that's on premises or in the cloud. So this is just some of the indicators that you can work with to find potentially malicious behavior of just things doing abnormal things. That is what we're looking for in security, is abnormalities, anomalies. So there's some sample things, login detected from a retired employee. Granted, that person should have lost all access to the system, but companies are companies, and oftentimes that doesn't happen. Someone logging in outside of working hours, often because attackers are in other time zones, so it'd be unusual for them to log in at 10 p.m. Or someone from the janitor, or someone in HR accessing financial records. If you can segment your network and properly tag things, you can notice when weird permissions or weird access is attempted. So the kind of artifacts you have, these are just some, and these, we'll talk about the fidelity of different indicators, but a lot of these can change. Hashes change, you change 1 byte and the hash is completely different. It's a one-way algorithm, so if you put something in, you change 1 byte of it, you'll get a completely different hash. URL addresses, obviously people can just register stuff on the internet, so it changes all the time. IP addresses, same thing. You can lease infrastructure. There's lots of cloud services. Attackers are just sort of, building infrastructure and then utilizing it for a campaign, and then all that infrastructure goes away because it eventually gets detected. It gets on blacklists, all sorts of stuff. But those are some of the indicators you can rely on as an intrusion is beginning. So those are various indicators of compromise. So TTPs is what they developed for the APT1 report from Mandiant. This is discovering why and how you're doing something, because generally when an attacker figures out a pathway to do something, they just do that over and over because they've got the process figured out. Oftentimes they will sort of assign it to here's the A team, A team makes the TTP, and then they just pass along the procedure to B team, and B team goes out and attempts that same attack all over the place. We'll talk about some frameworks that describe tactics and techniques, but the tactic is why they're doing it, what does it get them, usually access, and then techniques, how they do it, and then the procedure is that particular way that they did it, with what tool, or with a malware that did it, or what commands they ran. That is the actual indication of their behavior. But ultimately, it's driven by what they're trying to achieve with the tactic. So what in a phishing example, the tactic is initial access. They're just trying to get in, rather than the sort of compromise or reconnaissance or exfiltration. Just trying to get in. the technique they used is phishing. The procedure they used was malware. It was the attachment on the email or a drive-by download or something along those lines. Have you stumbled into the MITRE ATT&CK framework yet? So curious. Huh? Yeah, okay. So I won't go too much into it, but anyways, it's fascinating just to browse through that, or to look at an APT report or a breakdown of an attacker and see, like, they'll often list, like, here are the TTPs from the MITRE ATT&CK framework that they utilized. So it's breaking down, like, what tactics they're using and what techniques. Okay, I do have a slide. I mean, there's a bunch. That's why I think rather than just scrolling through, finding an attack report can frame the context of why that's interesting and how they actually utilize it. But like each one of these things you can read about, and it will explain like what are the data sources you would use to find this technique, as well as like examples of like APT reports. So you could see individual like crime groups and how they used it. But like each one of these things is like abuse of some element of like networking and computers. So a lot of these are like forensics-based descriptions. Like I mean that in the sense that like this was developed as an archive of like to describe attacker behavior. It is often difficult to detect a lot of this stuff. Like it is forensics on after an attacker has done something, you're like, oh, now I found all the things they did. It can be very difficult on the front end to detect all of this. And we still build tools with that in mind, but some of the things are so noisy, or it's just so different in every environment. You can't just write like a simple detection that's going to catch it every time. It's just something you can attempt and sort of build out. And ideally, you want like data sources that will cover different parts of the attack, because there's this concept of defense in depth in security, where you're trying to, if you miss it here, you catch it here. You miss it here, you catch it here. And so something like MITRE ATT&CK can drive how a company looks at what they have in their security program and what gaps they aren't covering yet. Another interesting one is the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. If you compare it to MITRE ATT&CK, it's very similar. They sort of just like combine a lot of things into weaponization and delivery and exploitation. Like MITRE has defense evasion and credential access and all these various things, but they've sort of consolidated into 7 steps rather than, I think there's 13, 14 tactics now. Keeps changing. But yeah, the idea is just to tag attacker behavior. So if you find a low fidelity signal, like something that alerts all the time, but like, so you can't look at it every time, but then that same system is doing something from the delivery phase and from the installation phase. Now maybe those 2 signals together might indicate an attacker that normally, because those things are too noisy by themselves, but now you're able to tie it together because you tagged it like, well, this might be from this tactic, this might be from this tactic. The diamond model is something that also was developed, I can't remember for which APT report, but just sort of describing the adversary and their capabilities versus sort of like on the other side of the infrastructure and the victim. Just another interesting way to look at things. The pyramid of pain, made by my lovely coworker, David Bianco, is just sort of describing how trivial certain things are to change. So like, ideally, we want to discover an attacker's TTPs. It would be great if we also found the tools, because then if they attempt to use that tool again, or that configuration of that tool, it would be so much easier to find them across the board. But these things just sort of are kind of easy to change. Like I said, most attacker infrastructure, maybe less a month. I mean, like oftentimes you'll get an email campaign, like a phishing campaign, and you'll work it, and all their infrastructure, like, even if you did click the bad thing, their infrastructure is already taken down, even though there's lots of redundancies and so on. These things change all the time. Hash values, IP addresses, domain names. Network and host artifacts, and when he says annoying, it's annoying for attackers to know that you have that. When you have like individual things on the network, sometimes there's something very interesting called a JA3, well actually there's JA4 signature, which is a hash of the SSH key exchange to a web page. So it hashes a lot of unique identifiers about that key exchange, because often attackers will, set up HTTPS or utilize an HTTPS connection, but they don't change the certificate that they use for every SSL connection. So if you're detecting on JA3 hash, it can be like, oh, this is a known attacker setup because they use the same infrastructure, and it's a little bit harder to change. And then individual tools, if we can sort of like find indicators of those tools in our environment and know that we reliably detect them, or tools that are similar to them, that is also very challenging for them to change. And then again, TTPs, they generally do the same thing over and over. Any questions before? I feel like I just rambling, but I love rambling, so I hope you do too. So on the defense end, something we like thinking about is the people, policies, processes, and technologies. As an analyst, I used to find policies very boring and uninteresting, but it can actually be utilized really effectively to sort of like make sure that when new systems are brought into a networked environment, that we're following certain standards to make sure that they're protected against attack. Because ideally, if you're working as an analyst, you are in the detection and response angle of security, but there is a prevention angle that ideally you would like to prevent attackers from being able to access it all. But and policies help institute better preventative policies as well as detection and response policies, making sure things are logged, that sort of stuff. And then the people is the people implementing the technology. The processes are those runbooks. Like, what do we follow when we detect something? If your runbook is not accounting for every possibility, then it has room for growth because you could be evolving that process to account for something more interesting or more potentially relevant of your organization. And then again, the technologies that are the tools that help us do that. So there's a lot of awesome tools out there. If you haven't used Security Onion, it's a lovely Linux distribution that has basically open source versions of what has expensive products but endpoint detection and response, which is kind of like the modern antivirus, just a little more insight into what the processes are actually doing. Data loss prevention, like file integrity monitoring, like tagging files is like, this is HR stuff, this is accounting, why is someone from HR accessing accounting, that type of thing. As well as a SIM with Elasticsearch and Kibana. But regardless, it really takes, you can install a technology and it can just sit there, or a person can implement processes on the technology that actually make it useful. So different organizations are following this to varying degrees. It's different with different people, but regardless, it's something to think about and how you play in that environment. I won't go over every aspect of this, but there's so many elements to defense. It's not just blue team, red team. I like this breakdown of green team, that's enhancing with automation, can improve process, make analysis so much better. Yellow team, that's the engineers, often the people who are maturing the tools and technologies and processes. Orange team facilitates interaction and education. Phishing is still the most likely infection vector of all time. Like it's still above like 90%. The big breaches you hear about, most often they got in from a phish, and really the only way to prevent that is to educate users and get users on board with the security of an organization. So still a very important team. And then purple team is just blue team and red team working together. But that can be so valuable to find out what you need to defend against, because if red team was able to do it, so are attackers.
Is there a black team there?
I think that there should be. Yeah. You can bring black team into any team. So again, this is just a breakdown of different roles in an organization. Generally, so we have SOC here, but there's some overlap with digital forensics, which is sometimes a separate team. But if you're a SOC analyst with forensic skills, you are highly valuable in the SOC. Threat hunting is SOC going out of their way to find threats rather than just reactively responding. You're proactively looking for threats. Threat intel can be very useful. Most of the fancy threat intel vendors, they have access to so much information that they're able to collate and quickly find high value indicators so that if you have threat intelligence, you see a weird network connection and some other company found out that was bad, 2 days ago, and you have updated threat intel, now you know because someone else found it first. And detection engineering is the actual alerts that get sent to the SOC. And then incident response is when SOC finds actual, and these sometimes are all the same. You could be in the SOC and do forensics and do incident response and do engineering. It really depends, but oftentimes they're sort of segmented out where the SOC is first, they're triage. They're just going through the alert list because oftentimes there's lots of crappy alerts. And someone's got to look at them. But when they find something bad, they send it to incident response, who are usually very skilled forensics people, but they're sort of just organizing a plan of attack to make sure you find every indicator of the attack in the network, because you kind of have to shut it off all at once. You don't want them to get another chance to pivot. You don't want to find all the indicators and then be I think we found them all, cut off access, and then you think you did a good job, but right now the attacker's already on another machine and re-initiating their attack and knowing that you just found them, so they'll be even more careful. There's clicks. But when I talked earlier about the sort of the evolution of SOC process and how you can be a part of that, I think it's really important because this is the idea with incident response, that every time something happens, your process improves. The idea is that it should be an endless feedback loop of determining what are the risks, what are our vulnerabilities in the organization, and then determining how we protect those things, whether it's preventative or detection and response. And then establish and architect those defenses. And then we're implementing, collecting, whether that's logs, so that we make sure that we can detect on those things when they happen. And then here's where the SOC is. They're in the analyzing report and the respond and review section. Because now you're looking at those logs that were built by our determination of what our risks are. And ideally, you get to the respond and review section and you're well, we found this and it would help if we had this in the future. Hopefully that actually continues the virtuous cycle. But oftentimes a SOC can be in a reactive state where they're kind of just responding and reviewing. There's not a lot of interconnection with other teams to help sort of feed back into that security loop. And I'm not blaming anyone. It's just sort of it's a reality that companies are very complex. They're full of silos of people that don't talk to each other. So sometimes just being the person that talks to other teams and asks them what they need can help you in the future, sort of hey, I need something. Can you help me out? Because you help them out. And that sort of cooperative security process can be very helpful. And so just a breakdown of what are generally the roles in a SOC, because the analyst can be sort of there can be multiple tiers of analysts. We talked about incident responders. Those are often sort of top tier. But basically they're investigating events, researching and identifying threats and identifying what's bad. The engineer is the one who is designing individual detections and just deciding what shows up to the analyst. And then an architect is sort of thinking about this sort of overall picture of what tools do we have, what do we implement, and why. But those are it's different in every organization, but those are generally how I would describe the breakouts of the different roles. And ideally, all those people talk to each other and get along because that improves that security process over time. Here's some of my lovely coworkers. So this, again, is from the Cybersecurity Defense Analyst course. But the idea when you're working in a SOC is you're attempting to prevent security incidents. You often just have a queue of alerts and you're just working through alerts and you're following a runbook and deciding what is bad, what is not bad, and then escalating when necessary. And when there's an incident, that's when you sort of call in all the big guns. If an incident is large enough, you need to call in legal, all sorts of things in a big enterprise. But ideally, you're trying to confirm or deny whether a security or data breach has occurred. And hopefully it hasn't. So really, with detection and response, there's sort of the reactive angle, where you're triaging alerts and attempting to find things that are bad based on detections. But there's also, there's actually one other piece that I really like just to briefly talk about. Is so there's detection and response. There's also deception and response, which I think is very cool. If you go to the website, I think it's canarytokens.org. you can just set up like a little canary, like canary in the coal mine kind of thing, where like it's a fake registry key or a fake user account, and you throw it into your system. The only people that will touch those are attackers because they're looking to like ping your entire network. Who does that? Except, I mean, maybe your admin might, but you still want to know that your admin is pinging your entire network, or like who's adjusting something in Active Directory. So canary token, I love deception because it's careless attackers will set those off. And I mean, I've heard of some like big companies moving to a deception response angle because it takes so much less time to set up. Like you can just set up deception and wait for it to go off, rather than you don't detect quite as early, which is the danger and the risk that every company sort of has to manage. But I just think it's another interesting angle to think about. And you can set up yourself. You can set up a canary token and then attack yourself and witness the email come in your inbox from you attacking yourself and setting off your own canary. And then threat hunting. That's the proactive looking, like, we know this is a threat that's targeting our industry, so we're going to go look for it in our logs. And hopefully you have the logs to do that. But those are generally the two types of attempts. So alert triage, this is generally what you're trying to do when you get an alert, is identify the who, what, when, where, why, potentially the how, and then deciding whether it's a true positive and security incident, and now S has hit the fan, or false positive, and hopefully there's another one here, I would say benign positive, where it's like, it did find the thing, that is correct. It is not a false positive. It did find the thing we're looking for, but it's not bad. So there's a subsection of false positive that's benign positive. But yeah, when something bad happens, there is generally a runbook in place that incident response follows along with, of which could be involving legal if it gets too big. And then false positive, this is sort of the benign positive idea that like provide feedback. Like if it is not finding the thing as well as it could, maybe we could tune it, reconfigure it, or maybe look for different data that would tell us the same thing but with higher fidelity. And this is a workflow by the lovely David Bianco again. But these are the types of questions that you're asking. Was this an incident? Did it cause damage or did it succeed? What happened? What assets were affected? And how should we respond? I'm just sort of jumping just to get to demo time. And this is basically what we're doing in incident response. An organized approach to detecting security incidents. And usually there's an incident response plan in place to define what we do when we find bad things. I'm so close to the end. I kind of just want to get to demo. Regardless, threat hunting is like generally not automatic because your detection and response program is your automatic. That is what it is you're relying to generate signal for you to go investigate. Threat hunting is like you have a hypothesis in mind. Now go search your environment, like for things that you aren't detecting on, which may be harder to detect on because they're so noisy. So it may be there's a category of executables and elements of the Windows operating system called living off the land binaries, LOL bins. For Mac, I think it's GTFO bins, and there's one for Linux as well. But the idea is like places like system processes that the attacker will use because they're system processes. So they make normal traffic all of the time. So it's very easy to blend in. So often a threat hunt is looking at those types of like things you can't detect on because they're so noisy, or you could with risk-based alerting, which I talk about all the time, but I won't talk about today. But ideally, you're going and looking in those places that have high noise ratios to low signal. Like I said, documentation, a huge part of being an analyst, suggesting what could be improved to help improve this incident response process. And yeah, notes or suggestions for other analysts that will help streamline the response cycle. Ideally, you work in a place that has a virtuous, like a nice cycle between analysts, engineers, and architects. But sometimes you sort of just gotta like push your elbows around to make that happen because it really depends on the place that you work. But yeah, ideally, your feedback is very important. Okay, all right, all done. Yay. Questions? Anybody want to talk about something cool? Security? I mean, I have stuff to show, but.
No questions?
When dealing with smaller medium businesses, we talk about incident response plans or disaster recovery plans. Small businesses, medium business, we don't have a lot of those. It's usually the big ones, right?
Yeah, almost every time. Yep. Yeah, I know it's a very unfortunate situation. Like I would much rather protect small and mid-sized businesses, but they don't have the resources. They don't have the money. They don't have the time. Honestly, I think the deception and response is a decent small to mid-size approach because it's so much like I could go into a small mid-sized business, set up some canary tokens and leave, and like they'll get notified when something bad happens and just call me in and I'll find out. I'm not saying I do that, but like part of me wants to do consultancy or something like that because yeah, most of what I talked about today is companies with more than 1,000 employees, which I think it's good to point that out that there are going to be, like cybersecurity jobs in like small organizations, nonprofits, and so on, and that's a really important task. But you're going to wear a lot of hats, and it's going to be very busy. So you sort of just have to triage what you can, like set up the most effective program you can. Because some people, I imagine there's a lovely scrappy team here at GCU defending the network because I know a lot of friends that work in like public schools and hospitals don't have nearly as much infrastructure and time as a Fortune 500 company. But it's valuable experience and you'll learn a lot more because your role is less defined. Like you'll be able to do so much more because in a big company, it's like you do that and that's all you do. And then smaller organizations, it's like, can you please do everything? And it can be a huge learning experience. So Steven, you said you wanted to go over dashboards a little bit, alright? Yes. Okay. So I have a bunch of resources I could share, but one of my favorite things, if you haven't played Splunk's Boss of the SOC, it is like a blue team CTF. There's more nowadays than there used to be. A lot of the stuff online used to be very attacker focused, which is honestly the fun part. It's more fun to attack, I think. But bots has been around now for, I think we're on version 8 or 9. But you can just go to bots.splunk.com and create a splunk.com account, and then you can access all these little mini scenarios. Some of them have a lot less instruction. It's more like, here's a data set, and maybe an app that sort of tells you about it. But varying levels of instruction. I would say that the two most introductory, well, there's the getting started with Splunk for security, which I think is interesting, but these two right here, investigating ransomware with Splunk and investigating APT with Splunk, awesome little built-in apps that guide you literally step by step by step. And I haven't looked at it in a while, but I will use information from this to build our first dashboard because it helps to have a data set. So if you go into the resources section, it'll give you a username and password. I will just give you an example of, whoops, I want the actual server. No.
Welcome to the investigative ransomware.
No. I want to go here. So you can actually just go here without logging into bots.splunk.com, and then the username, and it's 1.5. So what I like about this one, so when you log in, there is this cool app called the Investigating the Splunk Workshop. And it's the same one for the investigating APT and investigating ransomware, because there's these two scenarios listed here. But it's a great walkthrough. It's so cool. So you just sort of start with the scenario. You've got the APT prologue, and you sort of just walk through. It talks about the Lockheed cyber kill chain that I talked about. But then you just keep clicking next, and it will show you actual screenshots of Like, so this is related to the bot's questions and answers, which isn't, the questions and answers aren't available here, but it works through the questions one by one. So like, what is the likely IP address of someone from the Poison Ivy group scanning I'mReallyNotBatman.com for web application vulnerabilities? And then it talks just a little bit about using SPL, and then just gives you a search. Like, we're looking at the index bots v1 and looking for the website I'mReallyNotBatman. So if I open this up, Splunk will run that command. And now we have these thousands of events of hits against I'mReallyNotBatman. But what we're trying to do here is what is the likely IP address of the Poison Ivy group scanning the website. So what's great about this data set is that it is real data that we actually attack ourselves and then witness it in real time, because it is hard to generate fake data, but also that's how you actually find bad things, because you have to distinguish what is anomalous, what is not anomalous. So the first thing that we do here is just to find out what are the source types that have data in them. So for example, Suricata is an intrusion detection system. We have monitoring on our HTTP traffic. We've got our firewall traffic here from FortiGate, and then we have Windows IIS events. But what we're trying to find out is what is the attacker, or who is the most likely attacker. So if I look at this data set, these are raw events over here on the right, but these are the various fields in the event. So I'm looking, who are the sources that are hitting my external edge of my network? So I would be looking for source, which is right here. Those are the 3 IP addresses of things hitting our network. Granted, in an enterprise, it's going to be a lot more IPs than that, but something that might indicate scanning activity is repeated traffic over and over and over to a degree or a volume that is different from other things. So in this case, it's probably this one right here, which if you step further into the events, we're like looking at different source types to confirm or deny. But the idea is just sort of breaking things down. And we can, this is what I was looking for. So rather than looking at raw events, so like this is great because I have all the detail, every single log that happened in our network. And yeah, I can search over here for, you know, like the field I was looking for, but it can be a bit manual. And like if we were to example, make a dashboard, we want our dashboard to do the thinking for us. So we don't have to scan through like individual events. We don't have to look through all the fields because there's a ton of fields that aren't relevant for us. So what I was looking for was this command right here, stats. I'll make it a little bit bigger. So stats. So I want statistics counting the source IP and then renaming that as requests by the source IP. And it's sorting in descending order. So we'll see the highest amount of requests at the top. So the idea is I get a much simpler table of events that looks like that. Like this. Yeah. So like this source IP made this many requests. So now we've sort of like taken that raw data that, yeah, we could figure out one by one, like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm looking for source, and like that will help me find the attacker. If I write stats count by, that's ultimately what I was looking for, and I can just get this data. I'm just getting that table, and that is all I needed to know to determine what is the most likely IP address of the attacker scanning our server. So like oftentimes when you're in a SOC, you're making dashboards or SPL, you're crafting it in a way that gives you the thing you need to know for analysis. Because it is good to have all of this data when you need it, like the number of packets that came in and the cookie length or content length. I mean, there's a ton of data in there that may be relevant when we're going into like the incident response part of things. But as an analyst, we kind of just care about the abstraction. Like, what is the abstraction that helps us determine what is bad versus what is good? And then hopefully, our abstraction is not missing the context that would be helpful for us to make a determination like that. But that's the idea. I'll let y'all go through that because I just want to show sort of like making a dashboard in Splunk. It's been a while since I've done this, but it's basically the same thing. So at the top of every Splunk window, in the tabs up here, there will be a search, which is just the raw search, as well as dashboards, where you can create some of your own. So there's even some built in for the workshop, and that's what that whole sort of walkthrough is. I'm gonna do, so there's Dashboard Studio, which is new, but it doesn't have all the functionality of classic dashboards, which I prefer. But I will sort of make an example real quick. So dashboard title, likely, noisy, annoying attackers. And then, so now I've got this screen right here. There is like what I like about the non-dashboard studio experience. There's like XML where you can do all sorts of like fancy stuff and like do tokens, and I'll show you a cool dashboard I made because I'm really proud of it. But ideally we just want to add a panel, and then I'm just going to make a new panel. I want statistics because I want to like pop out those events with the number of requests. So I will make a new statistics table, and I will just take that search to throw here. And so, I mean, I might make an input that puts this in instead. Actually, let's do that right now. So I'm just going to take that out and add to dashboard. So right now that's not looking for anything in particular, but I'm going to add an input to look for some text, and it's just going to be called field 1. So now in this one, if I edit the search, I can look for field 1. So I cover it in $signs like that, indicating it's a token that can be used elsewhere. And when I apply that, it works as intended and works perfectly and doesn't not work in the demo. So I'm going to troubleshoot by opening this in search because I'm like, why did my field not get passed? It shows correctly. Oh, but I'm looking at the last 24 hours. So let's add another input, which is for the time. And actually we can save that. And then I don't know if this is actually using our time picker, so I have to make sure. I just added this. So like inputs are creating tokens, and tokens can be used further down in the dashboards. So you can drive a lot of like automated things where like, well, when I click this, I want the value that I clicked on to populate the next dashboard. So you can make this sort of like analysis process dashboard, which is really cool. And I will show you one of my favorite ones that I built. But yes, if I go here, I can select the shared time picker that I built into the dashboard. So now it will use that time range when I apply, and now it will actually look for those events. And so now I have a very simple dashboard that just looks for the source IP and number of requests. So like, again, this is a very simple example, but something I might do is want to make a drill down. So when I click source IP, now it looks, where has that source IP made traffic in any of my indexes? So I'm like, oh, they touched Circata, they touched HTTP. I'm used to doing it all in XML, but I know there's drill down. Okay, so on click, I want to say manage a token and a dashboard. I'll create a token called visible and set it to, oh, actually I have to store the IP and set it to the value that I clicked on. Yes, click value. So now when I click source IP, in the background a token just got set called IP. And so now, if I added another panel, let's do let's do one IP stats count by source type. So that will identify where has that made traffic. I'll use the shared time picker, so it's using the same one as the other. And now it should be good and it will tell me. It's going to be a long search though, because I just searched all the time on all indexes, which was foolish, and I would never do it in a production environment. But it is running, I think. It's a good sign that it's taking a long time. But like, that's the process of crafting a dashboard. Is like, when I click this, now I want to know this. So I'm making like abstractions to populate each panel of the dashboard, because what do I want to know next from this information? Like, oh, this is interesting. I will show you with my short remaining time, my very, very cool dashboard that I'm very, very proud of. Log in real quick. So this is a demo for a Splunk process, but I mean, you can do it with anything. Just Splunk calls it risk-based alerting. And I don't know if some of you saw me talk to the user group 2 weeks back, but the idea is, rather than a detection that looks for just one thing, like I saw this in the log and here's an alert, rather than that, because often what shows up when you just make one-to-one detections over and over and create alerts, you often get numbers like this. We've got 3,000 alerts for you to look at, which is not fun. So in the context of RBA, or risk-based alerting, risk notables, it's more like I've got a log source, I craft a detection, and I'm just making an observation. I'm just storing it for later, like that's interesting. And then when enough things happen on one system or user, like enough interesting things have happened, now we've got like a bucket of observations that's now overflowing with interesting information. So for example, those 3,000 went down to 13 because now we're actually aggregating and then looking at them in aggregate. So there's like some of the MITRE tactics that fired on this individual machine. And then I can see the list of detections. Like these are all the things that that system did, rather than like, we found one thing, you should go look at it. And oftentimes you're like, well, where do I start? What do I look at first? Oftentimes a runbook kind of helps you try and define that. But risk-based alerting is great for those things that you want to know about, but you can never want to learn about directly. Regardless, that's the premise for what we're going to go look at in my dashboard, which is here. Risk notable. No, it's in RBA journey. So I built a version of this dashboard when I was a customer and then rebuilt it. But the idea here is I want to look at a particular system and like dig into what happened. So Gravity is one of the compromised systems in this scenario. But it's like, okay, well, it's got a score of this. It has this many events in the past 30 days. A notable occurred, like an actual direct alert. So I could click on, oh, look, because I had something in the dashboard, look for the number of notables so that I could click it and be like, oh, did this object do anything interesting in the past 30 days? Well, now I can click on it, see the actual notable that fired, see the owner, the status, the last comment. If I clicked comment, it would drill down to the person leaving the comment, like list all the comments. I also like click to dismiss, I think is a cool UX feature. So like I made anything blue that means clicked and it does something. So like that does something, but anything else I click makes it go away, which you can set on like a token that has it depends. So when that token exists, it's visible. When it doesn't exist, it goes away. And then I've got a breakdown of the individual events that fired for this system. So I'm actually pulling this description from back end of Splunk. Like Splunk has like detections, and I'm pulling the detection description from Splunk's backend to populate into this dashboard, just so the analyst doesn't need to look for it. They have right here, oh, like what is system network connections discovery looking for? And it's like, oh, adversaries are attempting to access remote systems by querying for information over the network. And this is blue, so what happens when you click it? You click it, and then you will get the actual SPL for what that search is looking for. So that they can be like, oh, okay, it's looking for net use, net stat, net sessions, net file, this PowerShell command. And so that is, again, pulling from Splunk's backend to look at that. And then we also have a clickable too. So if you really wanted to, you could run that and see actual results from what that detection generates every time. If I was looking far enough back. And then I made, oh, go ahead.
So you had to create that, all of that information on that side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I just, so when you have a panel, you can click down here to open and search. So like, I mean, if you look at my search, this is a REST command against Splunk's internal index, and then I'm searching for a token of the thing that I just clicked on. So I'm looking for that title, and then renaming a field and popping out a table with those three things. So I mean, it's a relatively simple search, but it was something that our analysts kind of wanted. Like, you know, they want to know, well, why is this firing? Especially when they've got like, you know, we've got 300 detections, and they're like, I don't remember what exactly this is looking for. I liked having this context available just in case. Like, they don't always need it, but if they did, I have it right there.
So how long did it take you to create this table?
Oh, I mean, it was an evolving process over time, and because I built something similar as a customer, so much easier to build again. Like, if you want to look at the source code, I don't know how many lines this is, but it's a lot. I mean, it's 530 lines. I mean, I've got a lot in here because I've got the interactivity and all that built in. I'm just showing you like the art of possible. I don't expect it. Like, don't expect homework. Hopefully, with like, gotta have a fully.
You want to make sure you have colors in there. Just...
And then down here at the bottom, we have a timeline of events. This is just another way of using Splunk SPL to process something and then visualize it. So then I can look at individual events as they happened. I even have something to like, I just want to look at this section right here and then just look at those events rather than all events. I've got individual risk events as they happen. So it has a message, like this is kind of just a high level description of what it's looking for. This is like actual data from the event. Like there's a process path. Oh God, dark mode, that is really hard to read. But like use of Mishta was the name of the rule, but then I have, it fired from PowerShell. PowerShell was in this location. The parent of PowerShell was Mishta, and then we have the command line listed there. So an analyst looking in has a little more detail so that they could potentially confirm or deny whether that is a normal thing or not. But there is this, whenever you see PowerShell download string, generally not great. But another cool aspect of RBA is the idea of a threat object. So it's kind of like the thing that your risk object did. So the risk object is the thing that is gathering events and we're aggregating events onto. The threat object is an IP, a hash, file, a command line. So an analyst actually came up with this idea of like, well, when I'm investigating, I want to know how common that is. So I made a drill down to look at like, let's say Netstat. How often does that happen in my environment? Well, there's 220 events from it. It's coming from one risk rule, and it's on all of the objects in our environment. And now I can see just a sample of those events. I could drill down into this dashboard on that machine if I clicked on it. But then you find something interesting like this, where you've got an IP address, and that's where the only two systems connecting are the ones that were compromised. Because for an analyst, it made so much more sense, like, what is the prevalence of that object? Because I'm looking for anomalies. So he wanted to know, like, when I click on it, I would love to know how prevalent is that? How normal is that in my environment? So I made this little drill down, and it's one of my favorite things I've ever made because it was so brilliant. And I was an engineer at the time, but an analyst was like, you know, it'd be really helpful if I knew how prevalent this was or anomalous. And so I might even make a future dashboard that lists like outright on this table, like right here, prevalence equals X, or like something like that. Regardless, that is I mean, you can download this dashboard, you can look at the code. It is all on GitHub/Splunk/RBA. If you look in the dashboard section, it is this one right here. So if you really wanted to, you could peek under the hood, look at all the token setting, all the color setting, like, you know, this column name has this color, so you can pick it apart if you'd like, but I just thought it'd be fun to show a basic dashboard. This is how you set it up, but this is what it can do. Spend a lot of time on it.
So question, if you have someone who is creating a simulated attack, what's the process that you have to think about in order to write the language to find what you're looking for in Splunk?
So it really depends on what sources you have. Hopefully you have the log that indicates the attack happened, because you don't always have the data. That's a huge thing, is that, you know, you set off an attack that only, like, that's why the MITRE ATT&CK framework lists the data sources, like where would you find this if you were to look. So if you're not ingesting that data into Splunk, you're not going to be able to search on it and find it. So if it's a network-based attack and you're collecting network logs, there's also like differing levels of fidelity. So like, excuse me. A network log might just be like IP address connections. There's no detail there. There's no context. It's just like, I connected to this and I did that. So you can't write a detection on that because it's just like, all traffic looks like that. But if, for example, you had something that executes a command line on an internal host, and you have endpoint detection and response data, which is like monitoring every process and every command line that every process executes, now you're looking for the command line that attack indicates. So that might be one of the easier sources to use, EDR data. You can get that into your Splunk instances, because a lot of attacks are executing actual command lines on machines. Whereas with network data, you're more looking for general anomalies, but you're not going to be able to write a signature because all you have is like, this IP talked to this IP and it was this many bytes. There's nothing I can detect on that, except for statistical analysis and anomaly detection type stuff over time and longer time scales. But if you were to like simulate an attack against yourself with something where they have like, command and control and they can execute commands on the machine, if you have EDR data, EDR data is the golden, like, that's my favorite log to have because it's so detailed and it's so specific that I can look for, like, I showed that PowerShell download string. It's commonly used by attackers. So like if there was an attack like through Metasploit or Atomic Range or any of those that used PowerShell download string, now you can write a detection for PowerShell download string and then find it every time it occurs. So that's probably the way to go, is EDR data, if you can get that in there.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of off topic, but you said you were an artist in LA, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of projects did you work on? Just curious.
So I mostly worked for this company Titmouse, which is now huge. But they, like, back in my day, the first thing I worked on was an intern for Metalocalypse, which is my claim to fame. And then every other show I worked on, nobody's ever heard of. But DJ and the Fro, there's a Black Panther cartoon that was released in Australia. I think there's a larger release now. And then China, Illinois, and then just weird little side project commercials and stuff that nobody's ever seen. But it was fun while it lasted. But 80-hour weeks was brutal. At least I came into this industry with like boundaries. I was like, you pay me for 40 hours, so I'm gonna work 40 hours. So yeah.
I saw when you creating the dashboard, it was all written in XML. How important would you say knowing XML is to create one of those?
I mean, it's just like one of those things that if you pick it up, it's great. Like, and usually everything I've learned is usually because I had a problem that needed solving that required me to learn something. And so like XML, what I like about it is that it's very similar to HTML. And like back in my day, I crafted like my MySpace page. Like if I saw someone use a cool cursor, I would like use source and like steal the code and be like, yeah, I'm a hacker. But so like the similarity to HTML is helpful for me because it's like opening tags and closing tags. So you get like these trees of open tags and then you close the tags over and over. But like JSON is very similar. YAML is very similar. Like they all have similarities. So it's like if you learn one, you'll be more familiar learning the next one. So I wouldn't say it's like a necessary skill, but it's just something I picked up literally to figure out how to make cool dashboards. And they try and automate as much of it as possible. A lot of it you can probably do through the GUI now. I'm just used to doing with code.
And for Miss Mills.